If you read the plot summary for Picnic at Hanging Rock, you might think it's some kind of B movie. It might seem a little bit one-dimensional or even simplistic. But when you watch the movie, you get exactly the opposite impression. This is a complex and subtle movie with really distinct stylistic elements, where every character and every action have a story to them, and where there are some interesting, compelling undercurrents. Often if you scroll down on IMDb to the bottom, to the first films the director has made, you find things that are either very conventional or very unconventional, right? The early endeavors are either wild, unhinged art films, difficult to watch, difficult to understand, or they're sort of middle-of-the-road genre films, which are kind of the opposite. But this movie doesn't fall into either of these categories. In fact, it has a carefully curated relationship with the conventional. In some ways, this is actually one of the themes of the movie, the conventional. But the film itself is very, very deliberate, I think, in how it sometimes leans into more common images, like the colonial finishing school, the stiff headmistress. But sometimes it goes the other way, too. It leans out into experimental territory, wanders into the bush, and gives you pretty weird elements. This isn't a genre film, and it isn't an unhinged art piece. I honestly can't think of a lot of movies that balance these two quite the same way this does. There probably are some, but it's not common. This is a distinct movie. Before we go any further, it's worth mentioning that this movie is not as accessible as Master and Commander, The Truman Show, or most of Peter Weir's more famous movies. I think some people will find this boring. Some people might find it inconclusive. They should probably find a different channel to watch. For me, incredible movie. Why is this movie so much more than the plot summary, then? A lot of reasons. Let's start with the style, right? The style is remarkable in this movie. Peter Weir says sometimes that he starts with music, or that music plays a big role in forming sort of the imagery, the mood, the ideas of a film. This is common. I think a lot of directors do this. The score of this film is incredible. Classical, but bordering on the extraterrestrial. Sometimes very traditional, evoking perhaps, there's a element of it played on the pan flute, like panpipes, which are perhaps invoking some sort of indigenous Australian thing, some sort of natural thing, but they're also more colonial, classical themes going on. We'll see those in tension throughout the film. The score is repressive and overpowering at times, but also delicate, has immense momentum at times as well. Incredible, incredible score. This film, a lot of it has kind of an ethereal quality to it. It actually opens with a little quotation. What we see and what we seem are but a dream within a dream. This is interesting. One stylistic element of this movie that we see a lot of is the crossfade. Maybe this fits nicely with the ethereal moment and with this opening quotation. A lot of crossfades with one thing very slowly dissolving into another. There's some interesting choices about when we move from one scene to another, besides just the crossfade, some interesting transitions. For instance, the inciting event of the film. We only see part of it. And then we kind of cut abruptly to after the event. It's kind of interesting. There's a moment where Michael is asked by the police what one of the girls reminds him of. There's a hard cut to a swan. It kind of interrupts that train of thought. We see this hard cut to a swan, and actually, this swan that Michael sees, he's at a party, and at first it seems like it's a bit hard to tell where he is and when he is. It seems like maybe a flashback. Where do you remember from? Well, the swan I saw in the past or something, but it turns out not to be. It's later on. Is this a mistake that it seems like it's a flashback at first, that's a little bit dislocated? I don't think so. I think this is very purposeful, evoking some sort of wistfulness, this sort of dislocation, disorientation, ethereal nature, right? 3 examples right there of interesting ways where the movie sort of chops itself apart, where things are a little bit discontinuous, how you wouldn't really expect it. In the beginning of this movie, the movie actually opens with a spoiler. We know the girls are going to disappear from the very beginning. It's in the opening little text on the screen. So clearly this isn't the crux of the movie, I guess. On the other hand, it does set up some suspense. You wonder how it's going to happen, when, where, why. Are Michael and Albert going to be involved? Interesting. Like I said, some people might find this movie a little bit inconclusive, but you know the girls are going to disappear from the opening credits. So is this really the point, or are there other things going on in the movie? The beginning of the movie is in some ways unmoored. We get this quotation, and then we kind of drift through some old-timey gossip from the girls at the school, which is slightly hard to latch onto. They're reciting poems. It's a little bit hard to intuit their world, at least it was for me. Then we meet Mrs. Appleyard, who's the stiff headmistress, the aforementioned stiff headmistress of the school. And we have a little bit of conventionality to latch onto. This is a much more familiar character, the strict person. We kind of know where this might go. We see some other characters who are perhaps being bullied a little bit by the strict character, and we have, maybe this is a protagonist or something like that. So we start to get a little bit of conventionality into us that kind of allows us to latch onto a little bit more of what's happening. This takes us, I think, to one of the second major virtues of the film. To be clear, this I realize that description was somewhat disjointed. The point wasn't to necessarily talk about the plot elements there so much as the style, the disjointed nature of it, some of the slightly interesting chronological moments, the ethereal, floating nature of the film, a score that is ethereal, floating, but that also doubles down into more conventional things. And like I said, we get these characters that are in some ways more conventional that help anchor the plot to some ways. Very carefully curated relationship with the conventional, not an unhinged art film, but also not a genre film. Okay, but the second major virtue of this movie is that everyone in it has a story. Every action, there's something behind it. This isn't true in most movies. Most movies have protagonists, they have main characters, and they have stock characters, people you don't really pay attention to. And you can kind of tell who is who. The guy wearing the red shirt is probably going to die. Don't get too attached. In this movie, we're blessed with unexpected intimacy on almost all fronts. Lots of characters that seem like minor characters end up, the curtain's pulled back. We see them much more deeply than we would have thought. Also, some of the main characters, we come to learn a lot more about Mrs. Appleyard, for instance. Of course, kind of a strict person who turns out to have frailties, turns out to be uncertain, somewhat insecure. That's not so uncommon. We see that a lot, bit of a trope. But what makes this movie really strong, I think, is what we see about her relationship with everybody else. The staff, for instance, or Sarah, one of the students. There's two kind of teacher-like people who teach at this school. There's the French one and the other one. I don't remember their names, but the opening minutes of this movie are a little bit, like I said, they're a little bit hard to latch onto. The students in that point, preparing for their excursion, reciting the poetry, I didn't find it particularly relatable. But as we go on in the film, by the time we start to see the stories of the people who work with Mrs. Appleyard, the movie becomes much more intuitive. I mean, you can kind of imagine already what it's like to work with this woman, and in watching it, you can see not just, every moment contains not just a little story of this moment, but it seems to allude to a whole vast history, seems to allude to all kinds of conflicts. This has happened before. This is the first time. This is unprecedented, or this has happened many, many, many times. I'm used to this. I've been beaten down by this continually happening, right? Coworkers. The teachers also have interesting relationships with some of the students. One of the teachers' relationship with Sarah, the hints of empathy she has, the uncertainty she has. Is there something she should be saying to her that she doesn't? You can tell that this wears on her throughout the film. Interesting. The other teacher, the French teacher, is an interesting character as well. She has a very specific relationship with certain students, Miranda and Irma. She really cares for the students. She dotes on them. She's allured in some ways by their beauty. It's important to her to perpetuate this, to hold this up or something like that. When the students disappear, interesting reaction. I'm not going to get into the later parts of the movie here, but like I said, each one of these moments seems to allude not just to itself, but to many others. Then we have Michael and Albert, some of the strongest characters in the movie. Michael is British, Albert is Australian, and not genteel. They have a somewhat strained relationship at first. There's an early scene where we see them at Hanging Rock. They both work for like the provincial governor or something like that. They're at Hanging Rock the same time the girls are. They're drinking out in the bush. At least Albert is drinking. He offers Michael a drink. Michael says, sure. But Albert doesn't hand him the bottle. He just stands there holding it by his side. and Michael has to walk over to him and take it from his hand at his side. When Michael gives the bottle back, Albert doesn't reach out to get it. Michael has to return and deliver it back to him. You can tell there's tension in between the gentleman, the British gentleman, and the bushman, not really a bushman, but the more rugged Australian. Watching these two characters grow closer is almost as compelling as watching people that I actually know become friends. There's an interesting line when they're drinking. They see the girls cross a creek. Albert comments about their bodies, and Michael asks him not to. Albert says, well, I'm just saying what you are thinking. What is Michael thinking? Well, he seems to be enamored by the girls. He says, hold on, I just want to stretch my legs after they leave. And he follows them for a little bit. Perhaps he does something more. Later, the police ask Michael to describe the girls. What a moment. Michael previously was hiding his thoughts about them. He was trying to be modest. He was trying to keep these private, but he's asked about them, and you can hear the gears turning in his head. What should I say? Honesty, modesty. What should I say? What was he really thinking about them? What a scene. I think this clues us in a little bit to a big theme of this movie, which is a lack of vocabulary. The colonial world is in some ways very complex, very refined. The girls know when to take off their gloves. Appleyard tells them exactly when they should do it. In some ways, this is all very evolved, complex, so much to know and so much that they do know. But on the other hand, this world is completely at a loss to understand and to deal with other things. There are mysteries they can't explain, like the central mystery of this film. There's a moment towards the end of the movie where Appleyard looks at a picture of herself, a portrait, something kind of official, but something that she doesn't seem to match up to at all, that she can't live up to. She seems disappointed by this, the official image and the reality. Again, some ideas about the conventional and something more real than that. I don't want to spoil the movie. There's a lot more that happens besides some girls going missing. What I will say is that the disappearances in the film, the main disappearances, are not the only disappearances. There's two more. And these really undermine the refinement of the colonial system, really challenge its ability to be in touch with the things that matter. Really shows us how poorly people communicate, missed connections. Surely we could avoid certain conflicts, certain disappearances, if we could say things that we can't say. This isn't a moralistic film by any means, but it has some interesting undercurrents. Right from the first moment, really, colonialism is sort of evoked a little bit. Appleyard talks about one of our best English poets and such. It's kind of colonial nature, contrasting that to the nature, like I said, conventionality shows up again and again and again. Overall, let's see. A couple other things I wanted to mention. Really interesting use of slow motion in this film. Again, like I said, conventional at times, really not conventional at times. I think that's most of what I wanted to address. Clearly, I like this movie. Peter Weir is an incredibly wise man, making extremely refined movies. This is one of them. Like I said, it's not as approachable as some of his other blockbuster movies, some of his American work. But if you like movies, you'll like this one. Incredibly nice style, incredibly deliberate style. So many different stories, so many little moments. I mean, the way that Albert holds the wine bottle, so many things. So many little things, but also some big undercurrents that make it a truly interesting movie. So that's Picnic at Hanging Rock. I'd strongly recommend that you check it out.